Okay, we have made it to chapter 4. Welcome, everybody. We're now moving on from phonetics to phonology, but both of these topics are really sounds. The differences are that with phonetics we were describing the sounds, and we were talking about all speech sounds and how they have that universal nature in that we could describe them using the International Phonetic Alphabet. We were studying phones, so each one of those sounds we could call a phone. And then it was fairly limited in scope. It's not all that abstract or theoretical like the field of phonology is. Once you step into phonology, you're looking at the sounds of a particular language and how we would describe them, and how we break those sounds into phonemes, which is sort of an abstract mental grammar. And it takes a broader look at sounds. So just to review, phonetics has to do with the physical aspects of making sounds. We use brackets. This is one way to tell whether you're talking about phonetics or phonology. For phonetics, we use brackets for the sound t, right? This is the phonetic symbol for the t sound. Phonology has to do with abstract mental aspects of language. So, for example, the phoneme T, it's a sound type symbolized by the letter T. So you might still think of it as T, but there's some other allophones that we'll talk about later. So we can analyze phonemes just like we analyzed phones when we were talking about phonetics. You can see this is the exact same chart we talked about earlier. The difference is you would have one of these charts for each language, and then the phonemes would make up, just the phonemes for that language. So, for example, this one is English, and this should look kind of familiar to you by now. We talked about voicing, voiced and voiceless sounds. We talked about place of articulation, and then we talked about manner of articulation last time with your stops, fricatives, affricatives, nasals, liquids, and glides.
We've seen lots of ways that sounds can differ from each other. They can vary in voicing, in place and manner of articulation, in pitch or in length. Within the mental grammar of each language, some of these variations are meaningful and some are not. Each language organizes these meaningful variations in different ways. Let's look at some examples. In the English word please, I could pronounce it with an ordinary voice del, please. It would be a little unnatural, but it's possible. Or, because of perseveratory assimilation, I could devoice that L and pronounce it please. We've got two slightly different sounds here. Both are alveolar lateral approximants, but one is voiced and one is voiceless.
So you'll notice that we looked at these diacritics back in the IPA, that little mark underneath that shows that this normally voiced sound is now devoiced. That's what that little circle means.
But if I pronounce the word please or please, it means the same thing. The voicing difference in this environment is not meaningful in English, and most people never notice if the L is voiced or not. In the words van and fan, each word begins with a labiodental fricative. In van, the fricative is voiced, and in fan, it's voiceless. In this case, the difference in voicing is meaningful. It leads to an entirely different word, and all fluent speakers notice this difference. Within the mental grammar of English speakers, the difference between voiced and voiceless sounds is meaningful in some environments, but not in others. Here's another example. I could pronounce the word free with the ordinary high front tense vowel E, or I could make the vowel extra long, free. Notice that we indicate a long sound with this diacritic that looks a bit like a colon. But this difference is not meaningful. In English, both free and free are the same word. In Italian, though, a length difference is meaningful. The word fato means fate. But if I take that alveolar stop and make it long, the word fato fatto means fact. The difference in the length of the stop makes fatto and fatto two different words.
So, because in English this doesn't make a difference in meaning, I'm not so concerned when you're doing transcriptions of IPA whether or not you add that colon in there. You certainly can for those tense vowels, but don't feel like you have to because it doesn't affect the meaning as much. Now, if you're transcribing something in Italian, then you would definitely want to use that extra diacritic mark there. Just like if you were transcribing something from Portuguese, you would want to add that that little diacritic for nasal, nasality, because that's important for the meaning of the word in Portuguese, whereas it's not so much in English.
So here's the pattern that we're observing. Sounds can vary. They can be different from each other. Some variation is meaningful within the grammar of a given language, and some variation is not. Until now, we've been concentrating on phonetics, how sounds are made and what they sound like. We're now starting to think about phonology, which looks at how sounds are organized within the mental grammar of each language, which phonetic differences are meaningful, which are predictable, which ones are possible, and which ones are impossible within each language. The core principle in phonology is the idea of contrast. Say we have two sounds that are different from each other. If the difference between those two sounds leads to a difference in meaning in a given language, then we say that those two sounds contrast in that language. So, for example, the difference between fan and van is a phonetic difference in voicing. That phonetic difference leads to a substantial difference in meaning in English. So we say that f and v are contrastive in English. And if two sounds are contrastive in a given language, then those two sounds are considered two different phonemes in that language.
So, f and v are different phonemes, whereas l, la, and l, the two L's, voiced and voiceless L's that we saw earlier in please, are not considered different phonemes. So let's define phoneme. A sound that means something in a given language. It's the easiest definition I could come up with. And for all intents and purposes, letters are another way you can think about phonemes. A letter, sometimes a digraph, so two letters that make one sound, like the CH, can be considered a phoneme. At least a symbol for that phoneme. So we've got the phoneme for b, the b sound, for the sound, with the letter B and R here. We're going to continue on here to talk about how we create mental categories that become phonemes. Oops. Let's try that again.
Phoneme. A phoneme is something that exists in your mind. It's a mental category into which your mind groups sounds that are phonetically similar and gives them all the same language. That mental category contains memories of every time you've heard a given sound and labeled it as a member of that category. You could think of a phoneme like a shopping bag in your mind. Every time you hear the segment f, your mental grammar categorizes it by putting it in a bag labeled f. V contrasts with f. It's a different phoneme. So every time you hear that v, your mind puts it in a different bag, one labeled v. If we look inside that shopping bag, inside the mental category, we might find some phonetic variation. But if the variation is not meaningful, not contrastive, our mental grammar does not treat those different segments as different phonemes. In English, we have a phonemic category for L. So whenever we hear the segment L, we store it in our memory as that phoneme. But voiceless L is not contrastive. It doesn't change the meaning of a word. So when we hear voiceless L, we also put it in the same category in our mind. And when we hear a syllabic L, that's not contrastive either. So we put that in the same category. All of those L's are a little bit different from each other phonetically. But those phonetic differences are not contrastive because they don't lead to a change in meaning. So all of those L's are members of a single phoneme category in English.
Just so you know that, let's see if I can get it back up here. Here you go. That syllabic L just has to do with words like the word little, where the L actually carries the syllable at the end of the word, little. The E is silent, so it's actually a schwa sound coming in before the L that creates that syllable. But we group all of these different allophones together under the one single phoneme, L.